Syria, once celebrated as the heartbeat of Middle Eastern culture and commerce, now lies devastated by over 12 years of relentless war. In 2010, Syria's GDP stood at a robust $60 billion, fueled by thriving industries such as agriculture, oil, and tourism. Fast forward to 2023, and that figure has collapsed by over 50% to a mere $17.5 billion, leaving a shattered economy in its wake. This is expected to contract further in 2025. The human cost of the conflict is equally staggering. Syria remains the epicenter of the world's largest refugee crisis after over a decade of relentless conflict. Since 2011, more than 14 million Syrians have been uprooted from their homes, forced to seek safety elsewhere. Within Syria, over 7.2 million people remain internally displaced, with 70% of the population relying on humanitarian aid. Approximately 5.5 million Syrian refugees have found shelter in neighboring countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Beyond the region, Germany hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees outside the Middle East, with over 850,000 individuals as of today. This mass exodus has not only strained Syria's neighboring countries, but also created a demographic and economic vacuum within Syria itself, crippling its recovery prospects. Meanwhile, the Syrian pound has lost over 99% of its value, collapsing from 47 pounds per dollar in 2011 to over 13,000 pounds to the dollar in January 2025. Since 2011, Syria has been grappling with inflation, reaching an all-time high of 188% in March 2021. And despite coming down a little, it continued to be around 130% in 2024, making basic necessities like bread and medicine unaffordable for many. Alarmingly, 90% of Syrians now live below the poverty line, 83% are unemployed, and half of the country's population face extreme hunger, a stark contrast to the relatively stable economic conditions before the war. In December 2024, Bashar al-Assad's regime fell, marking a pivotal shift. The Assad government, long propped up by allies like Russia and Iran, succumbed to economic pressures, dwindling external support, and rising internal dissent. Now a new leadership attempts to govern amidst a fragmented nation, grappling with entrenched divisions, devastated infrastructure, and the remnants of a thriving shadow economy. What does post-Assad Syria look like under its new rulers? Can the country rebuild its shattered economy, or will it continue to rely on external aid and illicit trade? Will geopolitical rivals like Russia, Iran, and the US shape Syria's future, or will the nation find its own path to recovery? And what does this shift mean for the broader Middle East? Under Bashar al-Assad, who was in power from 2000 to 2024, Syria endured decades of authoritarian governance. Power was concentrated among a small elite, while corruption permeated key industries. Citizens faced limited economic opportunities and widespread suppression of dissent, fostering discontent. Economic reforms in the 2000s disproportionately benefited urban elites while neglecting rural communities. By 2010, 30% of Syrians lived below the poverty line, with unemployment exceeding 20%, particularly among youth. Rural regions, reliant on agriculture, were hardest hit, deepening resentment against the regime. Between 2006 and 2010, Syria experienced a catastrophic drought, worsened by climate change. Over 1.5 million people from agricultural regions migrated to cities like Damascus and Aleppo in search of work. This rapid urbanization strained infrastructure and heightened tensions between migrants and urban populations. In 2011, inspired by pro-democracy movements across the Arab world, Syrians protested against the Assad regime. These peaceful demonstrations were met with violent crackdowns, including arrests, torture, and killings. The regime's response fueled widespread anger, transforming protests into an armed rebellion. Syria's diverse population includes Sunnis, Alawites, Christians, and Kurds. The Alawite-dominated Assad regime faced growing opposition from the Sunni majority. As the conflict escalated, sectarian tensions were exploited by various groups, deepening divisions and fueling violence. International powers turned the war into a proxy conflict. The US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Gulf states pursued their interests, exacerbating violence. What began as a domestic uprising quickly evolved into a prolonged and complex war with global implications. Russia conducted 71,000 airstrikes to bolster Assad, ensuring the survival of his regime. Russia secures strategic access to the Tartus naval base, its only Mediterranean foothold, vital for projecting military power and supporting economic interests like arms sales and energy routes. Iran spends billions annually to support Assad, viewing Syria as a critical corridor for its Shia crescent, linking Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. This land route strengthens logistical ties, enabling Iran to counter Sunni rivals and expand regional influence. Iran's involvement includes military advisors, militias, and Revolutionary Guard units actively operating in Syria. The U.S. has invested over $15 billion in combating ISIS and supporting Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, which control oil-rich regions in northeastern Syria. U.S. involvement aims to curb Russian and Iranian influence, while backing opposition groups aligned with Western interests. Turkey focuses on preventing Kurdish autonomy near its borders, viewing the People's Protection Units, YPG, as a terrorist group linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Ankara has conducted several military operations in northern Syria, aiming to establish buffer zones and limit Kurdish control. Saudi Arabia and Qatar supported Syrian opposition groups during the early years of the war to counter Iran's influence in Syria and the broader region. This funding fueled the initial stages of the armed rebellion. These interconnected causes, political repression, economic inequality, environmental stress, sectarian divides, and foreign intervention, ignited a conflict that has devastated Syria's economy and infrastructure. With this foundation, let's examine the economic fallout of this prolonged war. Before the war, Syria's economy was diverse and thriving. Oil production was a cornerstone of the economy, accounting for 25% of GDP. Daily output stood at 406,000 barrels, with significant exports to Europe and neighboring countries contributing to foreign exchange reserves. Agriculture played a crucial role, contributing 20% of GDP and employing nearly 40% of the population. Syria was a top global producer of wheat, barley, and olive oil, with vast fertile plains like the Al Jazeera region sustaining domestic needs and exports. Tourism was a vibrant sector, generating $3.4 billion annually. Syria attracted millions of tourists to historic landmarks like the ancient city of Palmyra and Aleppo's old souks, both UNESCO World Heritage Sites. However, over a decade of war has decimated these key industries. Oil production had dropped to 90,000 barrels per day in 2023, from as high as 406,000 barrels per day in 2008. In 2018, it even went down further to as low as 24,000 barrels per day. Many of Syria's oil fields, especially in the northeastern region, remain under the control of militant groups or Kurdish forces, complicating efforts to restore production. The loss of oil revenue has crippled Syria's foreign exchange reserves and diminished its ability to import critical goods. Agricultural output has halved, with over 50% of farmland destroyed or rendered inaccessible due to conflict. Key irrigation systems and storage facilities have been destroyed, while widespread displacement has left farms untended. Additionally, a severe drought in 2021 exacerbated these challenges, pushing food insecurity to unprecedented levels. Tourism, once a source of pride and economic strength, has vanished. Many heritage sites have been bombed, looted, or repurposed as military bases. Palmyra, once a bustling tourist hub, now lies in ruins after repeated battles between ISIS and government forces. The collapse of these sectors has left millions unemployed, further fueling poverty and dependence on international aid. The scale of destruction in Syria is staggering. In early 2019, estimates of the cost of rebuilding the country range from $250 billion to $400 billion, figures that dwarf the entire government's 2018 budget of 3.9 trillion Syrian pounds, or around $8.9 billion, with some estimates even reaching up to $1 trillion. These figures also far exceeded Syria's pre-war GDP of $60 billion. The need for reconstruction spans across housing, transportation, and essential services like electricity and water. However, progress remains painfully slow. The Syrian conflict has led to significant destruction of essential infrastructure, severely impacting the population's access to education and healthcare. According to the World Health Organization, 57% of Syria's public hospitals have been damaged, with 37% no longer functioning. Additionally, more than 3,873 schools have been completely or partially destroyed, further depriving millions of educational opportunities. Key infrastructure in Syria, including roads, bridges, and power plants, has suffered extensive damage, significantly hindering recovery efforts. A 2017 assessment by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, estimated that the widespread destruction of irrigation infrastructure amounted to approximately $3.3 billion, severely impacting agricultural productivity. International sanctions, primarily targeting the Assad regime, have had unintended consequences on Syria's reconstruction capabilities. While these sanctions aim to pressure the regime, they have also complicated humanitarian activities and the delivery of assistance. The lack of a unified government and ongoing regional instability further complicates reconstruction. Many donor countries and organizations are hesitant to commit funds without assurances of transparency and equitable distribution. Syria's population has been dramatically affected by the conflict, resulting in one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, Jordan hosts 660,892 Syrian refugees, Lebanon 814,715, and Turkey 3.5 million. However, the actual numbers may be significantly higher because the government stopped registering refugees in 2015. Refugee camps across the region remain overcrowded with severe shortages of food, clean water, and healthcare. These conditions further exacerbate the suffering of displaced populations. Sanctions imposed on Syria, aimed at pressuring Assad's regime, have had devastating consequences. 12 million Syrians now face food insecurity, a situation exacerbated by hyperinflation and disrupted supply chains. The World Food Programme, WFP, reports that more than half of Syria's population is food insecure, with 3.1 million individuals facing severe food insecurity. In Damascus, the price of bread has risen sharply. For example, in November 2023, the Syrian Ministry of Internal Trade and Consumer Protection increased the price of a 7-loaf bundle of subsidized bread from 1,250 Syrian pounds to 3,000 Syrian pounds. These economic challenges force many families to make difficult choices between purchasing food and medicine, further worsening Syria's humanitarian crisis. The economic collapse, marked by an 84% contraction between 2010 and 2023, has led to significant currency devaluation and soaring prices for essential goods. The Syrian pound's exchange rate plummeted from 47 to the dollar in 2011 to 13,065 in January 2025, contributing to hyperinflation. Sanctions have restricted Syria's ability to import critical supplies like fuel, medical equipment, and agricultural tools. This has further crippled healthcare facilities and reduced food production, worsening the crisis. The war has fostered a thriving shadow economy, simultaneously fueling the conflict and providing limited survival mechanisms. At its peak, ISIS generated substantial revenue by smuggling oil to neighboring countries, exploiting Syria's porous borders. Estimates suggest that ISIS earned between $1 million to $3 million per day from oil smuggling operations. The absence of centralized control in Syria has allowed smuggling networks to flourish. Militias and criminal groups engage in human trafficking, weapon smuggling, and extortion, exploiting businesses and civilians for survival funds. Many Syrians rely on bartering goods or receiving remittances from family abroad. However, tightened sanctions and logistical challenges have made these lifelines increasingly unreliable. The shadow economy sustains the war, but at a heavy cost to ordinary Syrians, as black market goods are sold at exorbitant prices, further impoverishing the most vulnerable. As Syria transitions to a new chapter, its future hinges on the ability of its leaders to rebuild, unite its fractured society, and manage external pressures. Will Syria emerge from the shadow of war, or will its struggles persist for generations to come?